The morning came softly to the small city, the way it always did in early autumn, with a pale light that filtered through the clouds and settled gently on the streets below. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of temperature that invited sweaters and warm tea, and there was a quietness to everything. A hush that seemed to wrap around the buildings and the trees and the people walking slowly along the sidewalks. It was the sort of morning that felt like a deep breath, like the world itself was pausing before the day truly began. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of her small apartment, her hand resting lightly on the soft curve of her belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement that had become familiar over these past months. She was 7 months pregnant now, and her body had changed in ways that still surprised her sometimes. This growing heaviness that was also somehow a lightness, this sense of carrying something precious and fragile and entirely miraculous. The baby moved again, a soft rolling motion, and Sarah smiled, her other hand coming up to join the first, cradling this life that she and James had created together. The kitchen was warm behind her, the old radiator humming its familiar song, and she could smell the toast that James had made before he left for his early shift at the hospital. He was a nurse, her husband had been for 10 years now, working long hours in the emergency department, coming home tired, but always with that gentle kindness in his eyes, that soft way of touching her shoulder or kissing her forehead that made her feel safe and held and deeply loved. He had left a note on the counter, as he often did, just a few words in his careful handwriting telling her to take it easy today, to rest if she needed to remember that she was carrying their whole world inside her. Sarah moved away from the window and went to the small kitchen table, lowering herself carefully into the chair, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back, the tiredness that seemed to live in her bones these days. She was grateful for this quiet moment before she had to leave for work, this space of stillness in the morning light. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of traffic, the soft rush of cars on wet streets, and somewhere farther away, the gentle call of birds settling into the trees. Everything felt muted and peaceful, like the world was wrapped in cotton wool. She worked as an administrative assistant at Morrison Enterprises, a mid-sized company that handled logistics and supply chain management, and she had been there for 5 years now, working steadily, arriving early, staying late when needed, organizing files and managing schedules, and answering phones with the same quiet competence that she brought to everything in her life. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and she liked the routine of it, the way each day had a shape and a rhythm that she could depend on. Her coworkers were kind, for the most part, people who brought in cookies on birthdays and asked about weekend plans and shared photos of their children and pets. But things had shifted in the past few months, ever since Richard Morrison had taken over as CEO from his father. The old Mr. Morrison had been a gentle man, soft-spoken and fair, someone who remembered everyone's names and asked about their families with genuine interest. His son was different, had always been different even before the transition, but now that he held the power, that difference had become more pronounced. He was younger, ambitious in a way that felt sharp-edged and restless, and he moved through the office with an energy that seemed to demand attention and submission in equal measure. He spoke quickly, made decisions without consultation, and had little patience for what he called inefficiency, though Sarah wasn't always sure what he meant by that word. She had felt his attention on her lately, not in any way that was kind or encouraging, but rather as if he were measuring her and finding her lacking. Last week, he had stopped by her desk and looked at her belly with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between disapproval and dismissiveness, and he had asked her when she was planning to go on leave. She had told him gently that she intended to work until the end of the month, that she felt fine, that her doctor said everything was progressing well. He had nodded, but there was something cold in his eyes, something that made her feel small and unwelcome in a way that lodged itself quietly in her chest. Sarah finished her tea and stood slowly, moving through the familiar morning routine of getting ready for work. She chose a soft sweater in a pale blue color, something comfortable that accommodated her changing shape, and she brushed her hair back into a simple ponytail. In the mirror, she looked tired but content, the kind of tired that came from growing a life, from the body working constantly even in rest. She gathered her bag, checked that she had her lunch, the simple sandwich and fruit that James had prepared for her the night before, and she locked the apartment door behind her with a soft click. The bus ride to work was peaceful, the vehicle moving slowly through the morning traffic, and Sarah found a seat near the window where she could watch the city pass by in its gentle morning rhythm. Other passengers dozed or scrolled through their phones, and the driver navigated the streets with a calm expertise that felt reassuring. She thought about the baby, about the nursery they were slowly putting together in the second bedroom, about the soft yellow paint on the walls and the white crib that James had assembled with such careful attention, reading the instructions twice to make sure everything was secure and safe. They didn't know yet if they were having a boy or a girl, had chosen not to find out, and so everything was neutral and soft, welcoming whoever this little person would turn out to be. The office building came into view, a modest structure of glass and brick, and Sarah gathered her things and made her way carefully down the bus steps, thanking the driver softly. The lobby was quiet, the morning security guard nodding at her with a kind smile, and she took the elevator up to the third floor where Morrison Enterprises occupied a suite of offices that looked out over the street. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and there was the familiar smell of coffee and paper and the faint electrical scent of computers and printers warming up for the day. Her desk was neat, organized in the way she preferred, with files stacked carefully and pens arranged in a small cup, and her computer screen glowed softly as it came to life. She settled into her chair, adjusting the cushion she kept there for her back, and she began the day's work with the same quiet focus that had always defined her approach. There were emails to answer, calls to route, schedules to coordinate, and she moved through each task with a gentle efficiency, her fingers moving across the keyboard in a rhythm that was almost meditative. The morning passed in this way, peaceful and productive, and Sarah felt a certain satisfaction in the work, in the way each completed task created a small sense of order and accomplishment. Her coworkers stopped by occasionally, offering warm greetings, asking how she was feeling, admiring the growing bump, and sharing their own stories of pregnancies and children. Margaret from accounting brought her a muffin from the coffee shop downstairs, still warm and fragrant with blueberries, and Sarah accepted it with genuine gratitude, touched by these small kindnesses that made the day feel softer and more human. But around mid-morning, the atmosphere shifted in a way that Sarah felt before she fully understood. There was a change in the energy of the office, a tension that seemed to ripple outward from Richard Morrison's corner office, and people began moving more quickly, speaking in lower voices, glancing toward the closed door with something that looked like apprehension. Sarah continued her work, trying not to let the change affect her, but she felt it nonetheless, the way a room feels before a storm, that subtle pressure in the air. Richard emerged from his office just before noon, his suit perfectly pressed, his tie straight, and his expression set in lines that suggested displeasure. He moved through the office with quick, purposeful strides, and Sarah noticed that people seemed to shrink slightly as he passed, their shoulders tensing, their conversations pausing. He stopped at the desk of Tom Chen, one of the junior managers, and Sarah could hear his voice rising slightly. Not quite shouting, but definitely sharp, discussing some report that wasn't up to his standards, some deadline that had been missed by a day. Tom's face flushed, and he nodded repeatedly, apologizing in a quiet voice, but Richard seemed unsatisfied, waving, his hand dismissively before moving on. Sarah kept her eyes on her computer screen, hoping to remain unnoticed, to simply continue with her work in peace, but she felt Richard's approach before she saw him. He stopped at her desk, and she looked up, meeting his eyes with what she hoped was a calm, professional expression. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze traveling from her face down to her belly and back again, and there was something in his expression that made her heart beat a little faster, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of anxious awareness. When he spoke, his voice was measured but cold, the words precise and careful. He told her that he needed to discuss her performance, that there had been some concerns about her productivity, about her ability to keep up with the demands of the position. Sarah felt a confusion settle over her, gentle but persistent, because she knew her work was good, had always been good, had never received anything but positive reviews in her 5 years with the company. She tried to respond, to ask what specifically he was concerned about, but he cut her off with a raised hand, telling her that they would discuss it in detail later, that for now she should know that the company needed people who were fully committed, fully capable of meeting the challenges ahead. The implication was clear, though he never said the words directly, never acknowledged the obvious truth that her pregnancy was what he was really talking about. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest, not panic, but a kind of sad understanding, a recognition that she was being judged not for her work, but for her body, for the life growing inside her, for this temporary state that would end in a few months, but that seemed to him to define her worth entirely. He walked away without waiting for a response, and Sarah sat very still at her desk, her hands resting on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her with those gentle, rolling motions that usually brought her such joy. The office around her seemed to have gone quiet, or maybe it was just that she couldn't hear anything over the sound of her own breathing, slow and measured, trying to stay calm, trying not to let the tears that were gathering in her eyes actually fall. The afternoon stretched out long and difficult, though Sarah tried to maintain her focus, to continue with her work as if nothing had happened. But the conversation with Richard had lodged itself in her mind, playing over and over, and she found herself struggling to concentrate, her thoughts drifting to worry and uncertainty. What did this mean for her job? For her maternity leave? For the security that she and James had counted on? They had planned carefully, saved money, prepared for the months when she would be home with the baby, but all of that planning was built on the foundation of this job, this steady paycheck, this assumption that she would be able to return when she was ready. When the workday finally ended, Sarah gathered her things slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into her shoulders and back. The bus ride home felt longer than usual, the stops and starts jarring, and she was grateful when she finally reached her building, climbing the stairs carefully and letting herself into the apartment with a deep, tired sigh. James was already home, still in his scrubs, and he took one look at her face and immediately came to her, wrapping his arms around her with that gentle strength that always made her feel safe. She let herself lean into him, feeling the tears finally come, quiet and steady, and he held her without asking questions, just held her and let her cry until the worst of it had passed. Later, sitting together on the couch with mugs of chamomile tea, Sarah told him what had happened, describing the conversation with Richard, the cold implication in his words, the feeling of being judged and diminished. James listened with that focused attention he brought to everything, his face soft with concern and something else, something that looked like a quiet, controlled anger, though his voice when he spoke was gentle and reassuring. He told her that what Richard was doing wasn't right, wasn't legal, that pregnancy discrimination was a real thing, and that there were protections in place for exactly this kind of situation. But Sarah felt tired, too tired to think about legal battles or confrontations, too tired to imagine fighting when all she wanted was to work peacefully until her baby came, and then to spend those precious early months at home, learning how to be a mother, learning how to care for this new life. James seemed to understand, and he didn't push, just held her hand and told her that they would figure it out together, that whatever happened, they would be okay, that they had each other, and that was what mattered most. And sitting there in the warm lamplight of their small living room, Sarah let herself believe him, let herself rest in that reassurance, feeling the baby move inside her like a reminder of what was truly important. The days that followed moved slowly, each one blending into the next in a rhythm that felt increasingly difficult. Sarah continued going to work, continued doing her job with the same quiet competence. But there was a heaviness now, a sense of waiting for something to happen, some other shoe to drop. Richard largely ignored her, which should have been a relief, but somehow felt worse, as if she had already been dismissed in his mind, as if her presence was simply being tolerated until he could find a reason to make it permanent. Her co-workers noticed, she could tell, though most of them didn't say anything directly. Margaret brought her tea sometimes, squeezing her shoulder in passing, and Tom Chen stopped by her desk one afternoon to tell her quietly that Richard had been difficult with everyone lately, that it wasn't personal. Though they both knew that wasn't quite true, these small kindnesses helped, created moments of warmth in what was becoming an increasingly cold environment, but they couldn't change the fundamental reality of her situation. At home, James was a constant source of support. Coming home from his long shifts and still finding the energy to make dinner, to rub her feet while they watched television, to talk about plans for the baby and the future in a way that felt hopeful and grounding. He had started making some phone calls, she knew, talking to friends who knew about employment law, gathering information quietly in case they needed it. He didn't tell her all the details, didn't want to worry her, but she could see it in the way he held his phone sometimes, in the focused expression on his face when he thought she wasn't looking. The weeks passed, and Sarah's belly grew rounder, heavier, and her body felt the increasing strain of carrying this life. She was tired all the time now, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep seemed to fully address, and her back ached constantly, a dull, persistent pain that made sitting at her desk for 8 hours increasingly difficult. She used the cushion, took breaks to walk around, tried to maintain her productivity, but she could feel herself slowing down in ways that felt both natural and frustrating. It was on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after that first difficult conversation, that Richard called her into his office. The summons came through an email, brief and formal, asking her to meet with him at the end of the day. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, that familiar anxiety settling in her chest, but she finished her work and made her way to his office at the appointed time, knocking softly on the partially open door. He was sitting behind his large desk, papers spread out in front of him, and he gestured for her to sit without looking up. Sarah lowered herself carefully into the chair, her hands folded over her belly, and she waited, feeling that stretch of silence that seemed designed to create discomfort. When Richard finally looked at her, his expression was neutral, professional, the kind of face that revealed nothing of what was happening behind it. He told her, in that same measured tone from before, that the company was going through a restructuring, that they needed to make some difficult decisions about staffing, that they were looking for ways to improve efficiency and reduce overhead. He paused, as if waiting for her to understand where this was going, and when she simply looked at him with that same calm, quiet patience, he continued. He told her that her position was being eliminated, that they were grateful for her 5 years of service, that they would provide her with 2 weeks of severance pay and continuation of her health insurance through the end of the month. The words came out smooth and practiced, as if he had said them before or rehearsed them carefully, and Sarah listened with a kind of distant detachment, as if this were happening to someone else, as if she were watching a scene in a film rather than living through her own life. She wanted to ask questions, wanted to point out that there had been no mention of restructuring before, that her performance reviews had always been excellent, that this seemed awfully convenient timing given her pregnancy. But the words stuck in her throat, caught behind the sudden thickness of tears, and she could only nod slowly, standing up from the chair with as much dignity as she could gather. Richard told her she could finish out the week, that HR would be in touch about the paperwork, and then he looked back down at his papers as if she had already ceased to exist. Sarah left his office on legs that felt unsteady, moving through the now empty office space toward her desk, and she gathered her personal items slowly, carefully, placing photos and small mementos into her bag while trying not to cry, trying to hold herself together until she could get home. The bus ride felt endless, the evening traffic heavy and slow, and Sarah stared out the window at the darkening sky, feeling a kind of numbness that was probably a blessing, a temporary protection against the full weight of what had just happened. She thought about James, about having to tell him, about the worry this would cause him when he already worked so hard, carried so much. She thought about the baby, about the nursery they had prepared with such care, about all the planning they had done that now felt suddenly fragile and uncertain. When she finally reached the apartment, James was in the kitchen making dinner, and the smell of something savory and comforting filled the small space. He turned when he heard the door, his face lighting up with that warm smile that always greeted her. But the smile faded quickly when he saw her expression. He came to her immediately, taking her bag, guiding her to the couch, asking what was wrong with a gentle urgency that made the tears finally come, full and unstoppable. She told him everything, the words coming out between sobs, and James held her through it all, his arms strong and steady around her, his voice soft and reassuring even as she could feel the tension in his body, that controlled anger that he was keeping carefully in check for her sake. When she had finished, when the worst of the crying had subsided into quiet hiccups and tired breaths, James pulled back slightly to look at her face, brushing the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. He told her, his voice low and serious, that this was wrong, that what Richard had done was illegal, that they couldn't just let this go. Sarah felt too exhausted to think about fighting, too overwhelmed to imagine taking on a company and its resources, but James was insistent in that gentle way of his, asking her to trust him, asking her to let him handle some of the details, to take care of making some calls and gathering some information. That night, after a dinner that Sarah barely tasted, after a shower that helped ease some of the physical tension from her body, she lay in bed with James's hand resting protectively on her belly, feeling the baby move with those now familiar flutters and rolls. The room was dark and quiet, the window cracked open to let in the cool night air, and Sarah tried to let the peace of the moment settle over her, tried to let go of the day's pain and worry. But sleep was slow to come, her mind turning over the events again and again, replaying Richard's words, imagining the future that now felt so uncertain. Beside her, James's breathing was steady and deep, and she could tell he wasn't sleeping either, could feel the tension in his body even as he tried to project calm for her sake. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and they lay there together in the darkness, holding each other through the difficult space between waking and rest. The next morning brought a gentle rain, the kind that whispered against the windows and made the world outside feel soft and muted. Sarah woke to find James already up, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and when she made her way out to the living room, she found him sitting at the small dining table with his laptop open. Papers spread out around him, his expression focused and determined. He looked up when he heard her, and his face softened immediately, that worry creasing his brow as he asked how she was feeling, if she had slept at all. Sarah told him honestly that sleep had been difficult, but that she felt a little better in the morning light, a little more able to face what needed to be faced. James nodded, standing to pour her some decaffeinated tea, and then he sat down across from her, reaching for her hands. He told her that he had been doing some research, that he had called a friend from nursing school whose brother was an employment attorney, that there were definitely grounds for a wrongful termination case, that pregnancy discrimination was taken seriously by the law, and that companies couldn't just fire women for being pregnant. Sarah listened, feeling a mixture of hope and fear, wanting to believe that justice was possible, but also aware of how expensive legal battles could be, how stressful and prolonged they might become. James seemed to sense her hesitation, and he squeezed her hands gently, telling her that they would take it one step at a time, that first they would just consult with the attorney, see what he said, understand their options. There was no pressure to do anything she wasn't comfortable with, no expectation that she had to fight if she didn't want to, but he wanted her to at least know what was possible, what protections existed. Sarah agreed, feeling grateful for his steady presence, for the way he was willing to carry some of this burden so that she didn't have to face it alone. They spent the morning quietly, James making breakfast while Sarah rested on the couch, the rain, continuing its gentle percussion against the windows. The baby was active, moving, and stretching, and Sarah found a kind of peace in that sensation, in the reminder that whatever was happening in the outside world, this life inside her was continuing on its own perfect timeline, unaware and unbothered by adult concerns about jobs and money and justice. In the afternoon, James set up a phone call with the attorney, a man named David Liu, who spoke with a calm professionalism that somehow felt reassuring. Sarah sat next to James on the couch, the phone on speaker between them, and she listened as David asked questions about the timeline of events, about Richard's specific words and actions, about her employment history and performance reviews. James had gathered all the relevant documents, and he rattled off dates and details with the precision of someone who had been preparing carefully. David listened to everything, asking clarifying questions here and there, and when they had finished explaining the situation, there was a pause before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was measured but encouraging. He told them that based on what they had described, there appeared to be a strong case for pregnancy discrimination, that the timing and circumstances of Sarah's termination were exactly the kind of thing that employment law was designed to protect against. He explained that they could file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that they could pursue legal action against Morrison Enterprises, that there were remedies available including reinstatement of her job, back pay, and potentially damages for the emotional distress caused by the discrimination. But he was also honest about the challenges, about how these cases could be lengthy and stressful, about how companies often fought hard to defend themselves, about how the outcome was never guaranteed. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the information, by the idea of entering into something so formal and adversarial. But David's next words gave her pause. He told them that before pursuing litigation, he would recommend sending a formal demand letter to the company, laying out the facts of the case and the legal violations, giving them an opportunity to resolve the matter without a lawsuit. Sometimes, he explained, companies realized the strength of the case against them and chose to settle rather than face the expense and bad publicity of a trial. James looked at Sarah, his expression questioning, asking silently what she wanted to do. She thought about it, about the weeks and months ahead, about the baby that would be coming soon, about the peace she needed to prepare for that arrival. But she also thought about Richard's cold eyes, about the way he had dismissed her so casually, about the other women who might face the same treatment if no one ever pushed back. Finally, she nodded slowly, telling David that yes, they wanted to send the letter, wanted to at least try to resolve, this without things becoming even more difficult. David agreed, telling them he would draft something and send it over for their review, that he would keep the tone professional but firm, making clear that they were serious about protecting Sarah's rights. They thanked him and ended the call, and Sarah leaned back against the couch cushions, feeling exhausted from just this one conversation, from the emotional weight of recounting everything that had happened. The weekend came as a relief, 2 days when Sarah didn't have to think about work or confrontation, when she could focus instead on nesting instincts that were becoming stronger as her due date approached. She and James spent Saturday organizing the nursery, folding tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small, arranging stuffed animals on the shelf, testing the mobile that hung over the crib to make sure it played its gentle lullaby correctly. The room felt peaceful, filled with soft yellows and whites, and Sarah could imagine spending quiet nights there, rocking her baby to sleep, whispering soft words of love and comfort. On Sunday, they went for a slow walk through the nearby park, the autumn leaves crunching softly under their feet, the air crisp and clean after the rain. James held her hand, matching his pace to hers, and they talked about names they were considering, about who the baby might look like, about all the things they wanted to teach and share with this new person who would soon join their lives. For those few hours, Sarah could almost forget about everything else, could exist in that bubble of anticipation and joy that pregnancy had created. But Monday morning came too soon, bringing with it the reality that she still had to finish out her last few days at Morrison Enterprises. The thought of going back to that office, of facing Richard and everyone else who now knew she had been fired, felt almost unbearable. But Sarah made herself get dressed, made herself eat the breakfast James prepared, made herself walk to the bus stop with her head held as high as she could manage. The office felt different when she arrived, the atmosphere charged with an awkwardness that people tried to hide but couldn't quite manage. Her coworkers offered sympathetic looks, a few brave souls stopping by her desk to tell her quietly how sorry they were, how unfair it all seemed. Sarah accepted their kindness with gratitude, but she also felt a kind of distance from it all, as if she were already gone, already moving on to whatever came next. Richard stayed in his office most of the day, which was both a relief and somehow more painful. This confirmation that he felt no need to acknowledge what he had done, no obligation to offer even the pretense of regret or explanation. Sarah worked through her files, organizing everything for whoever would take over her responsibilities, writing detailed notes about ongoing projects and important contacts. She did it all with the same care and competence that had always defined her work, determined to leave with her dignity intact even if nothing else remained. On Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before her employment was set to officially end, Sarah's personal email pinged with a message from David Liu. The subject line read, "Demand letter, draft for review," and Sarah felt her heart rate pick up as she opened it on her phone. The letter was professional and clear, laying out the facts of her case, citing specific employment laws that had been violated, and demanding that Morrison Enterprises immediately reinstate her position with full back pay and benefits, along with a guarantee against retaliation and a commitment to providing reasonable accommodations for her pregnancy and eventual return from maternity leave. Sarah read it twice, feeling a strange mixture of fear and satisfaction. This was real now, not just conversations and consultations, but an actual legal challenge to what had happened. She forwarded it to James, then called David to tell him that yes, the letter looked good, that they should send it. He told her he would do so immediately, that Morrison Enterprises would likely have it by the end of the day, and that they should expect a response within a week or so. The rest of Wednesday and all of Thursday passed in a kind of suspended animation, Sarah going through the motions of work while wondering what was happening behind Richard's closed door, whether the letter had been received, what the response might be. She saw Richard only once, passing him in the hallway on Thursday afternoon, and his face was tight and closed, his eyes sliding past her as if she weren't there. Friday was her last day, and Sarah arrived at the office with mixed feelings. Part of her was relieved to be done, to be able to close this chapter and focus on the baby and the future. But another part felt the loss of this job she had held for 5 years, this routine and structure that had given shape to her days. Her coworkers brought in pastries and coffee for an informal goodbye, gathering in the break room to wish her well, and Sarah felt genuinely moved by their warmth, by the cards they had signed and the small gifts they offered. She left at 5 o'clock, carrying a box of her personal belongings, and the elevator ride down felt both final and liberating. Outside, the evening air was cool and fresh, and Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, feeling the weight of the past week settling and then beginning, slowly, to lift. At home that evening, James made her favorite dinner, pasta with a simple tomato sauce, and they ate by candlelight, talking about the week ahead, about the fact that Sarah could now rest properly, focus on preparing for the baby without the stress of work. It felt good to imagine those quieter days, mornings when she could sleep as late as her body needed, afternoons when she could read or walk or simply sit with her thoughts. But on Monday morning, everything shifted again in a way that neither of them had anticipated. Sarah was still in her pajamas, having just finished breakfast, when James's phone rang. He answered, his face curious, then suddenly alert, and Sarah watched as he listened to whoever was on the other end, his expression growing more and more surprised. When he hung up, he turned to Sarah with something like wonder in his eyes. The call had been from David Liu, and David had news that seemed almost too good to be believed. Morrison Enterprises had responded to the demand letter, and their response had been swift and unexpected. They were willing to negotiate, were acknowledging that perhaps mistakes had been made, were interested in discussing a resolution. Sarah felt her breath catch, not quite daring to hope. David had explained that the company's legal team recognized the strength of the discrimination case, that they understood the risks of taking this to court, both financially and in terms of public relations. They were prepared to offer a settlement that included reinstatement of her position with modified duties to accommodate her pregnancy, full back pay for the time she had been terminated, and a formal written apology. It seemed almost impossible, this sudden reversal, and Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes even as she struggled to understand what it meant. James pulled her close, his own voice thick with emotion as he told her how proud he was of her, how much she deserved this recognition of the wrong that had been done. Over the next week, there were more calls and emails, negotiations over the specific terms of the agreement. David handled most of it, but he kept Sarah and James informed at every step, making sure they understood their options and felt comfortable with the direction things were taking. The company's lawyers seemed eager to resolve the matter quickly, and Sarah wondered what pressures they were facing, what conversations were happening inside Morrison Enterprises that she couldn't see. Finally, 2 weeks after Sarah's official termination date, all the parties reached an agreement. Morrison Enterprises would rehire Sarah immediately, would provide her with paid leave until after her baby was born and she felt ready to return, would guarantee her position would be waiting when she did, and would include a cash settlement that covered not only her lost wages but also compensation for the emotional distress caused by the discrimination. The agreement also included provisions about workplace accommodations, about the company's commitment to reviewing its policies around pregnancy and family leave, about training for management on discrimination laws. Reading through the final settlement documents, Sarah felt a sense of vindication that was deeper than she had expected, a feeling that maybe her experience might actually make things better for other women who came after her. But there was one more surprise waiting, one that Sarah and James only learned about in a casual conversation with David a few days after the settlement was finalized. David mentioned, almost in passing, that the negotiations had been complicated by some internal changes at Morrison Enterprises, that Richard Morrison had apparently stepped down as CEO, returning to a lesser role in the company while his father resumed temporary leadership until a new CEO could be found. Sarah felt a complicated swirl of emotions at this news. She hadn't wanted to destroy Richard's career, hadn't been seeking that kind of revenge, but she also couldn't deny a certain satisfaction in knowing that his actions had consequences, that he hadn't been able to simply move on as if nothing had happened. James's reaction was more straightforward, a kind of grim satisfaction that justice had been served, that someone who had treated his wife so poorly had faced real repercussions. But more than any of that, Sarah felt a profound sense of relief and closure. The settlement meant security, meant that they could welcome their baby without the financial stress they had been facing, meant that she could take the time she needed to heal and adjust to motherhood without worrying about lost income or lost health insurance. It meant that when she was ready to return to work, she would be returning to an environment that had been forced to confront its own failures, that had made commitments to doing better. The weeks that followed were gentler, softer, filled with the quiet preparation that Sarah had been longing for. She spent her days resting when she needed to, walking when she had energy, reading books about babies and birth and motherhood. James continued working his shifts, but the stress that had been tightening his shoulders had eased, replaced by a kind of peaceful anticipation. They took a childbirth class together, learning breathing techniques and pain management strategies, laughing at the awkwardness of the exercises and the earnest intensity of the other couples in the class. They toured the hospital where Sarah would give birth, the same hospital where James worked, and met the nurses who might be caring for her, women who knew James and greeted him with warm familiarity and promised to take good care of his wife. Sarah's parents came to visit, bringing gifts for the baby and helping to put the final touches on the nursery. Her mother, a gentle woman with soft hands and a kind smile, spent hours with Sarah, sharing stories from Sarah's own infancy, offering advice and reassurance about the changes that were coming. Her father, quiet and steady like James, assembled the bassinet and installed the car seat, making sure everything was secure and ready. The due date came and went with no baby, and Sarah found herself in that strange, suspended time that comes at the end of pregnancy, when every moment feels like it might be the moment, when every twinge and cramp might be the beginning of labor. She tried to stay patient, tried to rest, and trust that the baby would come when ready, but it was hard not to feel impatient, not to wish for the waiting to be over. It was on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after her due date, that Sarah felt the first real contraction, different from the practice contractions she had been having for weeks. It came on slowly, a tightening in her belly that built to a peak and then faded away, and she noted the time and waited to see if another would follow. James was making dinner, moving around the kitchen with that familiar ease, and she didn't say anything at first, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily. But the contractions continued, establishing a pattern. And when Sarah told James what was happening, his face went through a series of expressions, surprise and excitement and nervousness all at once. He abandoned the dinner, moved to sit with her on the couch, timing the contractions on his phone, his hand warm and steady in hers. They labored at home for several hours, the contractions gradually getting stronger and closer together, and James was perfect, rubbing her back and helping her breathe through each wave, offering water and encouragement and unwavering presence. When the contractions were close enough, strong enough, they gathered the hospital bag they had packed weeks before and made their way carefully down to the car. The drive to the hospital was surreal. The nighttime city sliding past the windows, streetlights creating patterns of light and shadow. Sarah breathed through contractions in the passenger seat, James's hand reaching over to hold hers between shifts, and she felt a strange sense of destiny, of moving towards something huge and transformative and inevitable. The hospital was quiet when they arrived, the emergency department entrance James knew so well, now leading them to the labor and delivery floor. The nurses greeted them with professional kindness, getting Sarah settled in a room, checking the baby's heartbeat and her cervix, starting an IV and making her comfortable. James stayed by her side through everything, his scrubs replaced by street clothes, but his confidence and medical knowledge still evident in the way he talked with the nurses, asking the right questions, making sure Sarah had everything she needed. Labor progressed slowly through the night, hours blending together in a rhythm of contractions and rest, pain and relief. The epidural, when it came, was a mercy, dulling the sharp edges of the contractions while still allowing Sarah to feel the work her body was doing. James dozed in the chair beside her bed during the calmer moments, but he was alert and present for every significant development, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, telling her how strong she was, how proud he was, how much he loved her. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the hospital room windows when the nurse checked Sarah's progress and announced with a smile that it was time to push. The room suddenly filled with purposeful activity, the nurse calling for the doctor, adjusting the bed, preparing equipment, and Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline cut through her exhaustion. James moved to stand beside her head, his face close to hers, and she could see tears gathering in his eyes as he told her that they were about to meet their baby. The pushing was hard, harder than Sarah had imagined, her body working with an intensity that felt both powerful and overwhelming. But James was there through all of it, counting with her, breathing with her, celebrating each push and each small increment of progress. And then, after what felt like both forever and no time at all, there was a sensation of release and relief, and suddenly the room was filled with a new sound, the high, indignant cry of a newborn baby. The doctor lifted the baby up, still connected by the cord, and announced with a warm smile that they had a daughter. James was crying openly now, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her own face as the doctor placed the baby on her chest, warm and wet and perfect, this tiny person they had made together, this miracle they had been waiting for. Their daughter had a full head of dark hair and James's eyes, and she quieted almost immediately when she felt Sarah's skin against hers, her tiny hand curling around Sarah's finger with a grip that felt remarkably strong. Sarah looked down at her, this beautiful, perfect human being, and felt love crash over her in waves, so intense it was almost painful, so complete it filled every empty space inside her. James leaned down, his arms around both of them, and they stayed like that for a long time, the three of them together, while the nurses moved quietly around the room, giving them space to meet their daughter, to begin understanding what their lives had just become. The days that followed were a blur of feeding and sleeping and staring in wonder at this tiny person who now shared their home. They named her Emma, after Sarah's grandmother, and the name fit her perfectly, classic and gentle and strong all at once. She was a good baby, the nurses said, nursing well and sleeping in reasonable stretches, and Sarah fell into the rhythm of motherhood with a naturalness that surprised her. James had taken paternity leave, and he moved through the apartment with quiet competence, changing diapers and doing laundry and making sure Sarah ate and rested. He was a natural father, patient and gentle, and completely in love with his daughter, and Sarah fell in love with him all over again watching him care for Emma, seeing the tenderness in his hands as he cradled her tiny body. The first weeks were hard in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated, the exhaustion bone-deep and relentless, her body healing from birth, her hormones adjusting, her breasts tender and full. But they were also suffused with a kind of joy that made all the difficulty feel worthwhile. Every smile, every sound, every moment of watching Emma sleep in her bassinet, feeling like a gift. Sarah's maternity leave stretched out before her, 12 weeks that felt both generous and not nearly enough time. She spent her days in a cocoon of baby care, losing track of time, existing in a world reduced to the essentials of feeding and sleeping and holding this precious life. The settlement from Morrison Enterprises meant she could do this without financial stress, could focus entirely on Emma without worrying about money, and Sarah felt grateful every day for the fight James had encouraged, for the justice that had been achieved. Sometimes, during quiet moments while Emma slept, Sarah thought about Richard Morrison, about the man who had tried to take this security away from her, who had judged her pregnant body as a liability rather than recognizing her humanity. She wondered if he had learned anything, if the consequences he had faced had changed him in any meaningful way. But mostly, she found she didn't think about him at all anymore, that he had become irrelevant to the life she was building, the future she was embracing. James went back to work after his 2 weeks, returning to his shifts at the hospital, and Sarah learned to navigate the days alone with Emma. Her mother visited often, bringing groceries and holding the baby so Sarah could shower or nap, offering the kind of support that only a mother can provide. Sarah's friends came by too, bearing gifts and casseroles and the wisdom of their own experiences with babies, and the apartment that had felt small before now felt filled with community and love. As the weeks turned to months, Sarah began to think about what her return to work would look like. David Liu had made sure the settlement included clear language about flexible scheduling and the right to pump breast milk, about her position being held for her, and no retaliation for having pursued the discrimination claim. Morrison Enterprises had assigned a new HR manager, a woman named Patricia Chen, who had reached out proactively to Sarah, asking about her needs and preferences for her return, making it clear that the company was committed to supporting her. Sarah appreciated these gestures, recognized them as evidence that real change had occurred, but she also felt uncertain about whether she wanted to go back at all. The time with Emma had been so precious, so transformative, and the thought of leaving her, even in excellent child care, even for just a few hours a day, made Sarah's chest ache. She talked to James about it one evening after Emma had gone down for the night, the two of them sitting together on the couch with cups of tea, speaking in the soft voices that had become their habit around the baby's sleep schedule. James listened as Sarah voiced her conflicted feelings, her gratitude for having a job to return to, but also her wish that she could stay home longer, her concern about missing milestones and the precious early months of Emma's life. James was thoughtful, as always, and he reminded her gently that the settlement included enough money that they had some flexibility, that if she wanted to extend her leave without pay, they could make that work for a few more months. Or if she wanted to return part-time, the agreement included provisions for that as well. The point, he said, was that she had options now, choices that she hadn't had before, and they could figure out together what felt right for their family. Sarah felt grateful for his support, for the way he never made her feel guilty for whatever she decided. And that night she slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. Emma's soft breathing from the bassinet beside their bed, the most comforting sound in the world. In the end, Sarah decided to extend her leave to 6 months, using a combination of the paid time from the settlement and a few months of unpaid leave that Morrison Enterprises agreed to. By the time Emma was 6 months old, sitting up and laughing and reaching for everything with those chubby baby hands, Sarah felt more ready to think about returning to work, more confident that Emma would be okay in childcare, more sure of her own identity as both a mother and a professional person. She started back slowly, just 3 days a week at first, and the transition was easier than she had feared. Emma adjusted well to the daycare they had chosen, a small in-home facility run by a grandmotherly woman named Rose who had decades of experience and a gentle way with babies. Sarah pumped milk during breaks, stored it carefully, and felt proud of her body's continued ability to nourish her daughter even while they were apart. The office had changed in her absence, or perhaps it was Sarah who had changed, seeing everything through new eyes. The old Mr. Morrison was still serving as interim CEO, and he stopped by her desk her first week back to welcome her personally, to apologize for what his son had done, to assure her that things would be different going forward. Sarah accepted his words with grace, could see that he meant them sincerely, and she appreciated the gesture even if it couldn't undo the pain that had been caused. Her co-workers welcomed her back warmly, asking about Emma and cooing over the photos Sarah showed them, and Margaret from accounting brought her a card that everyone had signed, along with a gift card to buy something nice for herself. Sarah felt the warmth of these relationships, the sense of community that had always been the best part of working here, and she realized that she had missed the adult conversation and the satisfaction of completing tasks and the structure that work provided. The weeks turned to months, and life found a new rhythm, a balance between work and home that felt sustainable and good. Emma continued to grow and develop, hitting milestones that delighted Sarah and James, rolling over and then crawling and then pulling herself up to stand, each new skill a reminder of how quickly time was passing, how precious each moment was. Sarah found that motherhood had changed her in ways both subtle and profound, had given her a confidence and clarity about her priorities that she hadn't had before. She was still the same careful, competent person she had always been, but there was a new strength in her now, a willingness to advocate for herself and others that came from having fought for her rights and won. She became involved with the company's new employee resource group for working parents, helping to shape policies around flexible scheduling and parental leave. Patricia Chen was supportive of these efforts, seeing them as part of Morrison Enterprises' commitment to being a better employer, and slowly the culture began to shift, becoming more accommodating of the realities of people's lives outside of work. Sometimes Sarah would see Richard Morrison in passing, now working in a reduced capacity in the logistics department, and they would nod at each other politely, two people whose lives had intersected briefly and painfully but who had moved on to different paths. Sarah didn't feel anger toward him anymore, just a kind of distant sadness for the opportunities he had lost, the lesson he had hopefully learned about the consequences of treating people as disposable. Emma's first birthday came and went, celebrated with family and friends in their apartment. A simple cake and balloons and the joy of watching a 1-year-old discover the delight of frosting. Sarah looked around at the gathered people, at James holding their daughter, at her parents laughing together, at the co-workers who had become friends, and she felt a deep contentment settle in her chest. The past year had been difficult in ways she never could have anticipated, had tested her and challenged her and forced her to be braver than she knew she could be. But it had also brought gifts she couldn't have imagined, not just Emma, but also a deeper understanding of her own strength. A marriage that had grown stronger through adversity, a sense of justice achieved and wrongs made right. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah sat in the rocking chair in Emma's room, nursing her daughter one last time before bed. Emma's eyes were heavy, her body relaxed and trusting in Sarah's arms, and Sarah looked down at her with a love that still felt overwhelming in its intensity. She thought about all the worry during pregnancy, all the fear and stress and uncertainty, and she was grateful that Emma would never remember any of that, would grow up knowing only love and security and support. James appeared in the doorway, his face soft in the dim light of the nursery, and he came to kneel beside the rocking chair, his hand resting on Sarah's knee, his eyes on their daughter. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching Emma drift into sleep, and Sarah felt a peace settle over her that was deeper than rest, more profound than simply the absence of conflict. This was what mattered, she thought, this quiet moment, this family they had built together, this love that surrounded them like a warm blanket. The battles had been fought and won, the wrongs had been acknowledged if not fully corrected, and now they could focus on the future, on raising their daughter in a world that was slowly, imperfectly becoming better. Sarah carried Emma to her crib, laying her down gently on the soft sheets, covering her with the light blanket, turning on the mobile that played its gentle lullaby. Emma sighed in her sleep, her tiny fist curled near her face, and Sarah stood watching her for a long moment, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the flutter of her eyelashes, the peace of her sleeping face. James slipped his arm around Sarah's waist, and together they left the nursery, leaving the door cracked open so they could hear if Emma stirred. In their own room, they got ready for bed in the practiced routine of long partnership, brushing teeth and changing clothes and slipping under the covers with matching sighs of exhaustion. The apartment was quiet around them, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. James reached for Sarah's hand under the covers, and she turned toward him, seeing in his face the same contentment she felt, the same gratitude for what they had weathered together. Tomorrow there would be work and child care and the million small tasks that made up their days. But tonight there was just this, the two of them together, their daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, and the knowledge that they had fought for their family and won, that justice had been served, that they were safe and loved and whole. Sarah felt sleep beginning to pull at her, that gentle descent into rest that she had learned to welcome and trust. She thought about the story she would someday tell Emma, about the challenges they had faced before she was born, about the way her father had fought for them, about the importance of standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. But that was a story for another day, for when Emma was old enough to understand. For now, there was just this moment, this peace, this sense of completion and new beginning all at once. Sarah let her eyes close, let her breathing slow and deepen, let herself sink into the softness of the mattress and the warmth of James beside her. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but here in this small apartment all was calm and safe and filled with love. The last thought Sarah had before sleep claimed her completely was one of profound gratitude, not just for the outcome of their struggle, but for the journey itself, for the way it had shown her what she was capable of, what they were capable of together. She had been fired unfairly, had been treated with cruelty and dismissiveness, but she had not let that define her or diminish her. She had fought back, not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet determination and the support of people who loved her. And in fighting back, she had not only secured justice for herself, but had also made the world a tiny bit better for the women who would come after her, who would benefit from the policies and protections that her case had helped to strengthen. That legacy felt like something worth being proud of, something Emma would someday understand and appreciate. But more than any abstract sense of justice or achievement, Sarah was simply grateful to be here, in this bed, with her husband beside her and her daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, having weathered the storm and come through to this place of calm and safety. Sleep came gently, like a soft hand smoothing her hair, and Sarah surrendered to it willingly, her body and mind finally able to rest completely, knowing that tomorrow would come with its own challenges and joys, but that she was ready for whatever it might bring. The baby monitor glowed softly on the nightstand, Emma's quiet breathing a steady rhythm in the darkness, and the night settled around them like a blessing, peaceful and profound, and filled with the promise of new beginnings. The silence and the darkness, the family slept, 3 hearts beating in sync, 3 lives woven together by love and struggle and the simple, powerful act of choosing each other again and again through every difficulty. And if there were still echoes of the hard times, still shadows of the challenges they had faced, they were soft now, muted by time and healing and the overwhelming presence of this present moment, this peaceful now. The city outside continued its endless motion, people moving through their own struggles and triumphs, their own stories of injustice and redemption. But here in this small space, all was finally, blessedly still. The fight had been fought, the victory won, and now there was just this, the quiet beauty of a family at rest, safe in the knowledge that they had each other, that they had survived, that they were home. Sarah's breathing deepened, matching James's, and somewhere in her dreams she walked through a garden filled with soft light and gentle flowers, Emma laughing in her arms, and everything was warm and good and right. The story that had begun with such difficulty had found its way to peace, to resolution, to this place of rest and healing. And that, Sarah thought even in sleep, was the best kind of ending, the kind that felt like a beginning, like a door opening onto a future full of possibility and love and gentle, enduring hope.